want you to think back a little bit. Tell me, when was the last time somebody said to you, I've got some good news and some bad news? Comedians have oftentimes used this as a part of their stuff, haven't they? Got some good news, some bad news. Like the doctor who talked to his patient and said, got some good news and some bad news for you after those tests last week. And the man said, oh, said, well, what's the good news? And the doctor said, you've got 48 hours to live. And the man said, what? That's the good news? What's the bad news? The doctor said, couldn't get a hold of you yesterday. Isn't that terrible? Or the gallery owner that was talking to a painter that was exhibiting some of his artwork in the gallery, and the painter asked him. He said, do you think I'm one of those artists that whenever I die, my artwork will really gain in value? And the gallery owner said, well, yes, I really think you are. And he said, in fact, just had somebody yesterday who, he said, he asked about it. And he asked me that question, if I thought it would gain in value. And I said, oh, yeah, it will gain in value after he dies. And that guy bought everything in the gallery that you had painted. And the guy, the painter said, well, that's good news. He said, yeah, but I got some bad news. He said, well, what's the bad news? He said, well, the guy who bought all your paintings was your doctor. Yeah. And then the guy who came up and said, I've got some good news and bad news for you, to his friend. And the friend said, oh, no, just tell me the good news. I don't want any bad news today. And so the friend said, oh, okay. He said, well, your airbags work perfectly. First two are all right. Well, how about this one? The supervisor comes in and says, the lady says, well, the jobless rate is so low, there's no work here for you. So you're fired. That's pretty bad, isn't it? Yeah, that is pretty sad. Our lives are filled with good news and bad news, isn't it? Oftentimes, it's really not much of a joking matter because our lives are just filled with it. I mean, there are things that are good, there are things that are bad, and we've got to learn how to deal with those kinds of things, don't we? When we get to the life of Joseph, it seemed that bad news followed Joseph wherever he went, didn't it? It just was a part of Joseph's life. But one of the things we want to notice from Joseph's life is what happens with bad news, because God has a way of turning bad news into good news, doesn't he? And that's what happened in Joseph's life. And so as we get into Joseph's experience, we're going to be talking about his prison experience today. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 39. And we'll talk more next time as we go further into his prison experience with, the dreams that he interpreted, those of the cupbearer, that of the baker, and talk a little bit more about what happened there and why that was important for Joseph's life. But this time, we want to look specifically at the things that God did during Joseph's life where he had some bad news, but then God was able to turn it into some good news. We're going to go to, again, Genesis chapter 39. And let's start with verse 20 of chapter 39. Remember last week we talked about how Mrs. Potiphar had falsely accused Joseph of trying to assault her, trying to rape her. And after all these times where his Potiphar's wife, who was trying to take advantage of Joseph and just continued and kept on and kept on, and Joseph remained strong. He stayed away from that temptation. He relied on God. He gave God glory and credit for him staying away from Mrs. Potiphar. But Mrs. Potiphar got mad made the accusation. So verse 20, Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master. The king of Egypt, Pharaoh, was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and he attended them. And after they'd been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. I want us to go back a little bit and look at some of this bad news that Joseph has had in his life. Like we said, bad news just seemed to follow Joseph. Think of some of the things. Joseph was raised in this dysfunctional family, and his brothers hated him. They resented him for it because he was the favorite child of his father. And all those other brothers couldn't stand that. So they took it out on Joseph. So after I guess this is good news and bad news. The good news is they decided not to kill him, and they decided not to leave him in a pit to die. The good news, the bad news is they went ahead and sold him as a slave to Egypt, but he gets taken off to Egypt. And so bad news is he's on his way to Egypt. He's bought by Mr. Potiphar and serves in Mr. Potiphar's house for a while. And as things look up, well, then bad news hits again. We talked about it. He was falsely accused of wanting to rape Mrs. Potiphar. And then he's put in prison. As you think about the bad news, how would you turn some of this into good news for Joseph? Look at these things that happened to Joseph. How did God turn those into good news? Just think of some of the ways that Joseph experienced good news, even in the midst of all these. For example, he was raised in a dysfunctional family. His brothers hated him, but he wasn't included in his brother's immoral behavior, was he? That's good news for Joseph. Because we read about the brothers a little bit. We know about their life and how they were constantly in trouble, constantly doing things that disobeyed God. And Joseph wasn't a part of it. Because the brothers wouldn't include him. Instead, he was at home. By the way, we never read of Joseph ever going out and tending the sheep either, do we? He would go out and check on his brothers. He would go out and see how they were doing, but he never was out in the fields taking care of the sheep. He was a homebody. Sounds a lot like his father, doesn't it? Esau was out in the fields hunting. Jacob stayed at home with mom and became more domesticated. Well, that seems to be what happened to Joseph. But what that did was it kept him out of trouble. And it kept him close to home, where he must have heard stories about God and stories about Jacob's experience with God that maybe the brothers didn't always hear. So he had a little bit more grounding, perhaps, in his faith than the brothers did. But then he's sold as a slave to Egypt. What is the good news there? How could you find any good news in being sold as a slave?
He actually wasn't a slave eventually.
He was made in charge, wasn't he? Yeah, he sold to Potiphar, and he rose to a position of trust and influence. He becomes kind of the steward of the household. That's good news. But in Joseph's life, anytime good news hits, here comes the bad news again. He's falsely accused. How do you find any good news in that? And it seems like each time he gets bad news, it gets a little bit worse, and a little bit worse, and a little bit worse. What's the good news? Well, he passed the test of character, didn't he? He stayed true to God. He didn't give in to his temptation. He passed that test, and Mr. Potiphar spared him the death penalty. And if he'd been in just about any other house, he may have been put to death right there on the spot. He was in Mr. Potiphar's house who had come to depend on him so much, and so the good news was he wasn't put to death. Instead, I know, it's kind of like the lesser of two evils, I guess. You either get put to death or you get thrown into prison. The bad news hits again, doesn't it? But what's the good news there? Well, we just read about some of it. He's put in the king's prison. He's not put in some out-of-the-way, far-off dungeon somewhere. He is put in the king's prison right there under Mr. Potiphar's supervision, and right there where he's still close to Pharaoh. He rises to a position of trust and influence again, just like he did in Potiphar's house. And one of the significant things that happens to him in prison, and again, we'll talk more about this as we go forward in the story and the coming lessons, is that while he's in prison, he makes connections with some pretty powerful people. And isn't it interesting that each time Joseph's bad news gets worse and worse and worse, the good news in Joseph's life gets better and better and better. So let's think about a couple of things this morning. The first thing I want us to think through is, what was the reason for Joseph's good news? Why was it that Joseph was able to experience such good news? Each time the bad news comes, what is it that allows him to experience such good news? His character? As part of it?
Faith in God.
Faith in God has something to do with it.
His trust.
His trust in God.
Yeah, that was embedded in him.
Yeah. I want us to read a couple of different passages here. We'll come back to that one we just read here in just a minute. We're going to go back to the beginning of chapter 39. Now, we're going to read both of the incidents that take place here, and I want us to notice the same kinds of things come up both times. As after Joseph gets bad news, when the good news starts to hit, the same kind of elements of the good news keeps coming up. So notice again, chapter 39, starting in verse 1. Joseph was taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had been taken there. The Lord was with Joseph, so that he prospered. And he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw the Lord was with him, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Joseph put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. From the time he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. So Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. So as you look at what it was that was the result of the good news, notice the elements that showed up in this. We're going to go to the end of chapter 39 again. Notice again, as he's being thrown in prison, the second half of verse 20. While Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those who he held in prison. He was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did.
The Lord was with Joseph.
See,
Over and over.
that is the big one, isn't it? Over and over and over again, what the story tells us, what the account tells us is God's with him. God is a God who changes bad news and reverses it for those who love him, for those who are faithful to it.
He never gave up on God.
He didn't. And God never gave up on Joseph. The promise for Joseph, remember, he had these two dreams before he goes off to Egypt. And the two dreams served as these promises to Joseph that something good is going to happen in his life. Something special was going to happen in Joseph's life. And as we talked last week, that must have been a promise in Joseph's life that sustained him and kept him focused on God, even through each of the experiences with bad news. It was those promises of God. It's the same types of promises from God that sustain us, aren't they? Jesus says, I'll never leave you. I'll never forsake you. God says, be strong and courageous. Don't fear, because I am going to fight your battles. I'm going to be the one that stands with you. He says, by my grace, you're going to be saved. And so rely on my grace. Rely on my love. Rely on my promises. It's not based on what you do. It's based on my love for you. And so we can be like Joseph. We can rely on God to take his promises and turn our bad news into good news with time. I mean, what God does is he takes Joseph and he blesses his efforts to do what's right.
That makes me think that I have to be more faithful, more trustworthy with God, because I live by myself and I'm thinking to buy a gun because everybody's buying a gun to protect myself. But Lord has been gracious. He's been taking care of me every day and every night. And I am thankful for that. And I have to continue with that because I'm not good in a gun. I'm not good in weapons. And I can speak loud, but for a little while, that's all. So I just tell myself, Lord, I do have to put my trust in you.
Yeah. You put a gun in my hand and that'd be more dangerous to me than to somebody else, huh? So,
or kill somebody.
So you trust God to bless you as you're being faithful to him. And then God's able to take that bad news and turn it into good news. And the other one, and this is pretty significant as we look at Joseph's life, and y'all started talking about this, because on the one hand, it was God who was at work, and God was turning that bad news into good news for Joseph's life. But one of the important aspects of that was Joseph's reaction to his experiences. Notice he reacted to his experiences with positive behaviors. He reacted to them with positive attitudes. He was one that would take the things that that were thrown at him, and he would stay focused on good things. I don't know about you. I get sold as a slave to Egypt. What's going to be a reaction? Think about the things that Joseph has gone through. We talked about each of these bad news. We talked about different things that have happened bad to him. What would be the reaction of a normal person to each one of these? Especially as they get worse and worse and worse. Just give up.
Blame God.
Oh yeah. God, why are you doing this to me? Haven't I worked for you? Haven't I been faithful to you? Haven't I tried to do my best for you? He gets sold as a slave to Egypt. He's away from home. He's miles away from home. He's away from family. He's away from the father who loved him so much. And he's sitting there in Egypt. He doesn't have the benefit of a Bible like this to read every day, just like we do. He's sitting there in slavery, and he keeps his focus on God. I don't know about you. I think I'd be, well, man, I'm away from my family. I'm away from God's care. But hey, I'll go ahead and give it my best. I'll see if I can't benefit from this. And so he does his very best. And just as soon as he's on top of the world, he gets falsely accused and thrown into prison. What's going to be a normal person's reaction to that?
No, it's just like giving everything about yourself.
Well, it's the end of it. I should have learned my lesson the first time. That's it. I'm just gonna resign the fact that nothing ever good is ever gonna happen to me.
But there was something more special in Joseph.
There was the reaction that Joseph had to it because of his relationship with God. If he had decided not to, would any of us blame him? Would any of us have said, Joseph, come on now, buck it up there. Why are you feeling so down? A normal person might have done that. In Joseph's life, though, he has this different reaction. He goes from bad situations and he focuses on them to try to turn them into something good. Because he's a God who turns bad into good. I want you to notice one thing more that happens. This is probably the saddest statement that's made in Joseph's life, at least for me, as I'm reading it. You go through the story. We'll talk more about it later, but he goes through the story in chapter 40. He has these two individuals, cupbearer, the baker, who has these dreams. Joseph, by God's help, interprets the dreams for him. And you notice in verse 12, he's talking to the cupbearer. He says, "This is what your dream means." Joseph said to him, the 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to when you were his cupbearer. And then in verse 14, Joseph says, "But when all goes well with you, remember me. Show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. Even here, I've done nothing to deserve being put in the dungeon." Joseph has this glimmer of hope. He says, here is somebody that is going to be in Pharaoh's presence again soon. Pharaoh's going to learn about this dream. He's going to tell Pharaoh about it. And finally, I can get out of here and some good news will come again. But in verse 23, we read this verse. The chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Just whenever you think things are going good in Joseph's life, the other shoe falls. Things hit again, and bad news keeps coming to Joseph's life. What do you do in the situations where you got bad news? How do you react to them in a way that God can take those and turn them into good news? Because people have choices. By the way, here's your trivia question for next week. Okay, we're not going to answer it today. I want you to go and look it up. How long was Joseph in Egypt before he winds up in Pharaoh's court? Not going to answer it right now. Some of you say, "Oh, I know the answer. I know the answer." Okay, that's good. But the rest of you, go and look it up. How long was Joseph in Egypt before he winds up in Pharaoh's court? So be watching for that. We have choices, don't we? We can decide in those times of bad news whether we're bitter, whether we have those hard feelings and resentful feelings toward other people, or if we choose to forgive. We can choose to become bitter towards God. I mean, who would have blamed Joseph? God, why are you doing this to me? I have been so faithful to you. I've tried my best. I even stayed away from that Mrs. Potiphar, and now look where I am. And then I get this glimmer of hope that maybe I'm going to get out of here, and he forgets all about me. You ever gotten bitter toward God? Just got angry toward him? Or we can choose to trust in his presence in our lives. We can choose to be selfish. Who would have blamed Joseph for watching out for number one? Well, as long as I'm in these bad situations, I'm gonna get what I can out of it. I'm gonna try to make myself as comfortable as I can. Or we can choose to be selfless. We can choose rebellion. Have you noticed how many folks are choosing rebellion in our country right now?
The vaccination.
How much bitterness it must be behind all that? How much resentment because of perceived injustice, because of perceived mistreatment? People feel like they're not being treated well, and so they wind up rebelling, acting out in violent ways oftentimes. Or we can choose submission. So how does a person choose to stay away from bitterness and choose instead forgiveness, choose trust, choose selflessness, choose submission to God, especially during the times whenever they're bad? How do you do that? How have you learned to do it? Or how have other people that you've known learned to do that? Faith is so important, isn't it? That trust that God is still at work, that God is still going to do good, that God still loves me, that God is still with me.
You can remember what he has done already. Think of the ways that he's worked already.
Most important, I've heard this quote somewhere, and I can't remember now where I got it, and I've used it enough that I've decided I must have come up with it. But I don't think I came up with it. I think I stole it from somebody. But I've always kept it with me because it says, remember what God has done, he can still do. Because I read about all the stories in the Bible. I read about all the great things that he did. But I think that's just stuff he did. He can't do that anymore. Or I look back and I see ways that God's worked in my life, the way the things that he's brought good in my life, and then bad news hits again and I forget, hey, God can still do that. What God has done, he can still do it.
And you remember where it said that hearken to the voice of God, commandments. And also another one that I remember it says, look at Jesus, how he was submitted to God, to trust and obey. We're not perfect, but we see Jesus and that he was pleasing to God. So we have to, he was a servant to God for us all, not only me. So
we notice those people in Scripture who went through difficult times and how those godly individuals kept God's commands, how they were blessed because they followed him. Well, let's notice the things that Joseph did, because Joseph's story gives us some clues about how to keep from bitterness. If I'm a person who is not bitter, bad news is going to hit. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. We live in this Satan-stained world. Satan's always after us. Satan is going to try to attack us. And like we talked last week, it's because it's part of a bigger story. It's a bigger battle. It's a bigger war that's out there between Satan and God that I happen to be caught up in because God loves me. And so how do I prevent becoming bitter and becoming resentful because of the bad news in my life? Or if I'm in one of those times whenever things just are not going very well, and I want to stay away from that bitterness. Notice some things that we learned from Joseph's life. Number one, keep faith and hope alive. You mentioned that. Keep faith and hope alive.
There was a prisoner that was mentioned this morning that he had been murdered and he's been in prison for 75 years. He says, I know that what I did was not right. I said, but I had to do something in my life here in prison. He's done beautiful artwork, beautiful furniture, beautiful stuff. He's gotten his beauty and forgiveness and also the things that he did. And that's for others.
You see people who keep that faith and that hope alive, or even find it in the middle of that bitterness.
And I see other people blooming that way. And I look in my life, how I should carry the fruits for the Spirit of God, for God. And I feel like I'm inadequate in ways, but I thought to myself, you can do what you can for your act and glorify God. Like, we can keep on working on that light, that spark, that fire for the Lord in many different ways and forms. But, you give credit to God. You submit to God. And so, you know that you don't have, you do those things for not receiving anything back.
Yeah. Notice what Joseph did. He's in Potiphar's house and he's doing his best. Mrs. Potiphar comes along and like we said last week, Joseph could have given in and he could have given good rational reasons for doing so, but he came back to God, didn't he? I will not sin against God in this way. He's in prison. And the thing that whenever these two individuals come to him and say, hey, we've had these dreams, one of the things that Joseph tells them is, well, God can interpret those dreams for you. He doesn't forget about God. He stays faithful to God during those times. Secondly, live life and fulfill your responsibilities. If you want to keep from bitterness setting in, keep from resentment setting in, live life and fulfill responsibilities are given to you, even during those bad times. Keep plugging away at them. Joseph, he could have gotten in the prison cell and he just could have sit back and just resigned himself. Well, this is where I'm going to be the rest of my life. I might as well just kind of shrink back. And because every time I try to do good, every time I try to do something that is worthwhile and glorifies God, I just keep getting beaten down again. So this time I've learned my lesson. I'm going to stay under the radar. I'm not going to let anybody notice me. I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to sit back in the shadows and just hide. But Joseph didn't do that. He got right back in, didn't he? The prison warden saw the good things that he did, put him back in charge of important responsibilities, made him in charge of the prison cells that were under his care. He decided to do the best he could with the situation that he had. And that was important for reversing bad news into good news. Have care and compassion toward others. Isn't it easy whenever the bad news hits to just get into the poor me syndrome? Poor old me. Nothing ever good happens to me. And so I start looking for ways to satisfy and to make me feel better. I want you to notice what Joseph did. Chapter 40, the second part of verse 4. After they've been in custody for some time, so Joseph has been in the prison for a while now. Don't know how long, but he's been there for a while. Which, by the way, go and do the trivia question for next week and find out how long he's been there, and then you might get an answer to that question. But anyway, Joseph came to them, and yes, the answer is here. It's in the Bible. Just say, okay, Dewey, you're just fooling us. No, it's in here. So Joseph came to them and said, after they've been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night. And each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today? Now, what do you find? Do you find something remarkable, just like I do, in what happens there? They are all in prison together. Joseph is there because he's been falsely accused. He's been there for a while. We don't know how long, but he's been there for quite a while. Now you got these other two that are in prison. We will find out that one of them has also been falsely accused. The other one is there because he's guilty. But they're in prison with Joseph as well. Joseph comes along one day and he looks at him and says, oh, wait a minute. Why are you all so sad? Now that tells me two things. Number one, Joseph has noticed them before. Because today, he notices that they're not the same that they were the day before. Number two, it tells me Joseph has focused on other folks around him, not just himself. When we get into those bad times in life, whenever it's so tempting, it's so easy to turn inward and to turn self-focused. What Joseph shows us is that we need to stay out-focused. We need to stay looking at others and being compassionate about others. To be concerned about the bad news that's in their life, not just the bad news that's in my life. Because he sees these two in the prison and he says, what is wrong? You look so sad today. So keep your focus on other folks. And then courageously face injustice when the time is right. I find it interesting. We read about it toward the end of chapter 40. Go back again to verse 14. When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this prison. Then verse 15, I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews. Even here I've done nothing to deserve being put in the dungeon. Joseph has not, we don't have a lot of record of Joseph doing a lot of defending himself and fighting back like that. But when the time is right, when it's appropriate to do so, Joseph is not afraid to tell the truth and to fight injustice when it occurs. This was an injustice in Joseph's life to have him be put in prison. And when the opportunity came, he spoke out. Notice the way he speaks out. He speaks about the situation. He doesn't go into any, he doesn't start defaming anybody. He doesn't bring in characters into this. That old Mrs. Potiphar, she's no good. She put me here. Mr. Potiphar, I had given him my best of all I had in his house, and then he did me this way. My brother's back up. He didn't go into the explanation of people. He dealt with the injustice. How easy it would have been just in his bitterness and resentment to lash out at people. Instead, he deals with the injustice. And he will, and he does deal with it when the time is right. You want to stay away from bitterness? You want to stay away from resentment? Try some of these. Keep faith and hope alive. Live life. Fulfill your responsibilities. Have care and compassion on others. Courageously face injustice whenever you see that injustice take place. We think about making Joseph's lesson ours. Number one, how will you glorify God for turning your bad news into good news? You can look back and you know those times in your life whenever things have not been so good. Things have been rough. And as we think about trying to make this real in our lives, this is one that Angela and I have really, and my whole family, got my daughters here as well. We really had to think through and struggle with. I mean, we had a situation where Matthew and Cassie had the baby, and the baby died. And then Cassie has her brain tumor, and she goes through all those things that went through that. I'm telling you, that's some bad news in our life that hit one right after the other. When God spared Cassie's life, and she's back to full health now, did we remember to glorify God in that? To glorify him when the bad news turned into good news? Or do we just say, well, we were lucky with that one. Whew, we really dodged that bullet. Whew, man, getting back to getting the gun thing. I didn't mean to get back to that, but you know, or whenever we realize that the bad news has turned to good news, do I remember to give glory to God? To give him thanks, to honor him. Because in honoring him, it then shapes my character and it shapes my faith, and it makes me stronger in my relationship with God because I acknowledge and admit it was God who was at work the whole time. It wasn't just some lucky happenstance. It wasn't just some, well, I'm glad all the stars were in line because I got out of this. But we actually give thanks to God because God turned the bad news into good news.
I did not give you a lot of prayer. I didn't go up to you, but I had you in my mind and my heart, you and your family. And I really thank God that you came to church. You were there for us. You molded us. You made us what you just help us to be more faithful, more loving to God. And all those things we have been blessed by you and your family.
Thank you.
So I really thank you for that. And I thank God, yes, for your son, your daughter. It has been a blessing. It's been a miracle. It's been a wonders from God. My daughter survived the coronavirus. She almost died. I have Jamie and I have Brianna that she's gone into drugs. She's still in our lives. She's going our second child. She won't listen, but you know, and then my brothers and my father, my stepmom, they all had coronavirus. They didn't go to the hospital. How did that happen? Am I as old as they are and poor? I mean, I would say poor in a certain way, not poor, but they're rich and blessed. But God is wonderful. Not only that, other people have gotten well. Some people have the shots, some people don't have the shots.
And so, and
we're
let's
working
remember
We're
that,
working through it to see people sick. It's
and,
hard.
yeah, let's remember that God turns bad news into good news different ways. Let's just say that, and we experienced it both with the loss of the baby and also with Cassie. One did not make it through, the other one did.
Yeah.
Now, can we glorify God in both situations? Yes. We can glorify Him that He brought about good news in each situation. Now, the good news is very different for each one. Because sometimes we get into this problem where, you know, we'll give praise to God whenever He spares a life or whenever He brings about the result, the outcome that we want. But if it doesn't work out that way, then God must not have been at work. I love when people say, well, I'm so thankful that God answered your prayers on that. Did God not answer the prayers of the other person? Sure He did.
Everything.
Because God will work out good regardless of the bad news. It's just sometimes it's good news that comes surprisingly, or it's not always easy to see. For Joseph, I'm not sure Joseph could always easily see the good news. We look back at his life and we can see the good news. And so in either situation, we remember to glorify God because we have faith as He's turning that bad news into good news. So in what way do I need to glorify God? Maybe I haven't done that like I should. Secondly, how will you live with the bad news that you have today and anticipate the good news that God can bring out of it? See, that's what Joseph did. Joseph had this promise from God that something was going to happen. He didn't know what it was going to look like. He didn't know what it was going to be, but he had these dreams. And he knew that something was going to take place that was good. And so Joseph lived his life in Mr. Potiphar's house, in the prison, with the anticipation that something good was going to happen in his life. Think about Jesus. Jesus is in this boat with his disciples, and bad news hit, didn't it? There was this big storm that hit, and it's rocking and rolling that boat, and the disciples thought this bad news is just about to be the end of it. Joseph, where's Jesus?
Sleep.
He's asleep.
I'll feel him.
Yeah. How in the world could Jesus sleep? Because he knew there was still good news coming. He knew that God wasn't finished with it yet. Jesus knew that God was going to turn this bad news into good news. And so we live our lives when we're in the middle of the bad news, anticipating that just like God has turned the bad news into good news in the past, He can still do it now. So I move forward with anticipation. And the third, how will you avoid bitterness? How will you live faithfully, fully trusting?
I pray to God and I do good
And you
to all people.
how do you stay strong in your prayer life in order to develop that? How do you watch out and look around and share yourself with others, even during the bad news? It's those ways that we keep away from that bitterness, sitting in and resting in our lives and just focusing on God so that He can work through us and He can make good things happen. So think through those lessons. Figure out what it is this week that you need to focus on. Is it the giving glory to God? Is it living with anticipation? Some good news is coming, living life and fulfilling those responsibilities? Or is it to truly give God any bitterness and resentment that's trying to creep in, and allowing him to work something good in your heart.